And so when it comes to mental health, when it comes to thinking about athlete performance, when it comes to thinking about, right, what it looks like for everyday people, right? So we know what access, the pros get. We know what kind of, LeBron James spends, $1 million a year on his body alone, right? We get that, and that's amazing. But what does it look like for a JV basketball player, right? What does it look like for someone who, is competing at the D3 level, right? What does it look like for someone who's maybe even competing at a high level, but, is not making, $1 million a year. And so as we think about mental health and the everyday man, and the connection between all this stuff, I'm just excited to explore it as an athlete and a coach.
And so, I can definitely speak from the perspective of being an athlete, the competition, and, mental health is something that's also very, near and dear to my heart. Anxiety, depression, further beyond that are things that I've dealt with both, as an athlete, but also out off the field. So I can definitely see how both of those things are intertwined, but also separate. And of course, from the journalism perspective, I have been a news reporter the last 3 years working for Spectrum News. So I've covered, everything general assignment from local elections to school lockdowns to, local athletes making a big name for themselves on whether it's an Olympic stage or, just their nearby division one school. So I definitely think, there's we have a real strong cast of characters here today. So I'm excited to get into some of these topics.
Perfect introductions. So I'm gonna talk about my experience a little bit and then pivot. So be like around, I'll cut it to like 5 minutes. So for me, I played soccer and track growing up. To talk about the perspective of it, growing up, I remember playing soccer with my stepdad. I was like 8, 9 years old. And for me, the aspect of trying to be a perfectionist seeped in my mind because hearing criticism from my stepfather, always waking up at 5 in the morning, going outside, doing certain drills. Okay, make sure you're kicking the ball sharp. Make sure you're actually cutting when you're with stride when you're kicking the ball. For me, growing up, you never really truly realize until you get older, but those things, like even as like a elementary kid or a middle school kid or even in high school or even going into college, those things can still linger in your mind because ever since I remember as a kid, I was like, oh, my stepdad said I didn't do this well today. Dang, like I must be a failure. So I want to pivot like me talking about that a little bit so you guys can explain like your experience as athletes, like growing up as well, and the perspective that you guys have on that as you got older.
Well, for me, I would say with my experience being an athlete, I was always more so on the outside in. I wasn't like I played volleyball in high school 4 years. I also ran track in high school and college, but I was never like the star, like the starter. I was that guy coming off his bench who really had to earn his minutes. And I would say, for me, I think one thing that I struggled with back then was committing to the role of someone who at times didn't feel like whether or not his presence around there mattered. And I think that I've ran into people in my life who sort of dealt with that sort of bench warmer perspective. And it can be hard because I think as young people, especially, we want to feel that immediate satisfaction, right? Of I put in this much work. That means I get playing time, I get praise, I get minutes. And I think one thing that we're not taught at that age is that number one, there is such a thing as delayed gratification, which is it might take a long time before you start to see the fruits of your labor. And if you don't get that right away, it can be very easy to quit. Like I know athletes who are more athletic than me, who played sports at a higher level than me, who had potential to, to be starters and what have you. And they quit after their freshman sophomore year because they weren't getting the reps and the time they had before. And I think what's unfortunate about that process as young people, we're just not taught the value of just hanging in there, showing up every day, working hard, being a team player, because ultimately those things, whether it gets you playing time or not, is going to lead to a better path for you. Maybe it doesn't show up in the sport you play, but maybe it shows up in what you do afterwards, your career, or building friendships or relationships.
I think, man, a couple thoughts to build off this. I think one, before we even get to mental health, the thing that comes up for me is ego. And every athlete has an ego. And as a coach, I've really like read a lot of books, and I'm really like fascinated by ego. Because it's not a bad thing, right? Um, ego is what gets us through the door. You wouldn't even put on that uniform, if you didn't think at some level you had something to contribute. It's a good thing, right? That you have this belief in yourself, that you're capable of greatness, that you can achieve the unthinkable. But the hard part about that is that, like, regardless of where your skill is, like when you're always bumping up against ego, you come crashing down when you don't meet those expectations. And it can quickly, and I can totally relate to this in self-experience. Like it quickly snowballs into, right, self-doubt and, uncertainty, and then even just unrealistic expectations too. And so, I think one of the things, like before we even get to mental health, I think we need to have more conversations about ego. I think people know the word, but they don't necessarily know what it means. They think it's all bad. They don't see the good part in it too. And so having a healthier relationship with ego, it says, I am that guy, and today I am going to go score that goal. But if I don't, that's okay too. I'm still that guy. And I can, and it's that conversation that I think we're missing. And I see it as a coach, man. You can call it a generational thing. Maybe I'm getting old, but I'm sure it was the same for when we were coming up. But you know, these results, these moments on the sports field, like they are so closely tied to people's self-worth. Um, and as a coach, I'm really trying to get people to get out of that mentality. Um, because your self-worth is not, it's not one moment in time. It's the whole journey, it's the whole season, it's the process, it's what kind of attitude you bring. It's how you make your teammates better. Um, but as we keep talking about, mental health, I think it's important, but I think ego is a really interesting place to start.